They wanted a cinematic lifestyle on a minimum wage budget. They got a cinematic ending, all right. Just not the genre they were expecting. The hydraulics of the repo truck hissed like a dying snake, cutting through the humid afternoon silence of our cul-de-sac. It was a sound I had heard in my nightmares for years, but this time, I wasn't the one hiding behind the curtains. I was sitting in my car, parked 3 houses down, watching the tow driver hook the chains onto the bumper of my father's prized Ford F-150. My dad was out on the lawn, shirtless, his face a mottled purple map of rage, screaming at the driver. He wasn't using words, really. He was just making these guttural, animal noises of entitlement, waving his arms as if he could physically shoo away the consequences of his own actions. My mother was behind him, clutching the doorframe, looking smaller than I had ever seen her. The neighbors were watching, of course, peeking through blinds, pretending to water lawns that were already dead. And me? I just took a sip of my lukewarm coffee, feeling the caffeine hit my bloodstream with a clarity I hadn't felt in a decade. If you want to know how I went from being their obedient retirement plan to being the reason they can't even open a checking account without a cosigner, stay with me until the end. My name is Sarah. I'm 26 now, and I work in compliance for a mid-sized bank. I spend my days hunting down fraud, spotting patterns in the numbers that don't add up. But back then, I was just the good daughter, the one who never asked questions because I was terrified of the answers. I was the safety net they never bothered to weave for themselves. You have to understand, growing up in that house was like living in a theater production where the set design didn't match the script. Basically, the narrative was always that we were struggling. That was the word of the decade. Struggling. We were the victims of a cruel economy, of bad bosses, of an ungrateful government. My dad would come home from his shift at the plant, smelling of machine oil and resentment, and give us a nightly sermon on how the world was out to get him. My mom would nod along, stirring a pot of hamburger helper, her eyes wide with this performative martyrdom. And so, I grew up believing we were one missed paycheck away from homelessness. I internalized that fear. It lived in my marrow. I walked around with holes in my sneakers because I was too guilty to ask for new ones. I skipped field trips. I learned to make a loaf of bread last a week. I mean, honestly, I thought I was doing my part for the family survival effort. But here's the thing that used to drive me crazy, the thing I couldn't wrap my head around even as a kid. While I was taping my shoes together, the house was filling up with stuff. Not necessities, just stuff. It was subtle at first, a new microwave with buttons we didn't need. Then it was the premium cable package because my dad needed to unwind. Then it was these obscure collectibles my mom started buying from the shopping channel. Porcelain dolls with dead eyes that lined the hallway shelves, staring at me while I did my homework. When I would ask, very gently, how we could afford a new flat-screen TV when they just told me we couldn't afford my dental copay, the mood would shift instantly. The air in the room would get heavy, like the pressure dropping before a tornado. My dad wouldn't yell, which was almost worse. He would just look at me with this crushing disappointment and tell me that I didn't understand finance, that I was being ungrateful, that they worked their fingers to the bone so we could have nice things for once. He would spin it so that I was the villain for denying them a moment of happiness. And I believed them. I mean, you always believe your parents at first, right? You assume they are the captains of the ship, even if you can feel the water rising around your ankles. Have you ever felt that sick? Heavy knot in your stomach when you realize the people who are supposed to be your safety net are actually the ones cutting the ropes? By the time I hit 18, the dynamic had shifted from, "we are struggling," to, "you need to help us survive." It wasn't a request. It was an expectation. I started working at a diner the week after high school graduation. I was pulling double shifts, smelling like grease and maple syrup, trying to save up for community college. But every Friday, like clockwork, the emergencies would start. It was always something catastrophic. The water heater exploded. The car transmission died. The cat needed surgery. My mom would call me, her voice trembling, doing this perfect impression of a woman on the edge of a nervous breakdown. She would tell me that they didn't know who else to turn to. She would say that they were terrified they were going to lose the house. And obviously, my first instinct was panic. I couldn't let my parents end up on the street. So, I would transfer the money. $200 here, $500 there. Basically, my entire paycheck. I was eating shift meals at the diner because I couldn't afford groceries while they were fixing the car. But then I'd come home to visit, and the car would look exactly the same. The water heater would look ancient, but there would be a new smoker on the back patio. Or my mom would be wearing a new leather jacket that smelled like expensive tannins. When I asked about it, they would wave me off. They'd say it was a gift, or they got it at a garage sale for pennies. They were gaslighting me, but I was so desperate to be the good daughter, to be the savior, that I let them do it. I swallowed the doubt. I swallowed the anger until it felt like heartburn that never went away. And looking back, that's the part that hurts the most. It wasn't just the money, it was the emotional manipulation. They used my love for them as a weapon against me. They knew I was soft. They knew I remembered the version of them that existed before the greed took over completely. I mean, to be fair, they weren't always monsters. I have this specific memory from when I was 7. I had the flu, a fever of 103. My mom sat by my bed for 2 days straight. She made me crushed ice with Gatorade because it was the only thing I could keep down. She stroked my hair and sang these old lullabies, and for those 48 hours, she was the safest place in the world. I held on to that memory like a lifeline. Whenever they demanded money, whenever they called me selfish for wanting to keep my own tips, I would replay that memory of the ice and the lullaby. I convinced myself that the loving mother was still in there, buried under the stress of poverty. I didn't realize that the poverty was a costume they put on whenever they needed something from me. The breaking point didn't happen all at once. It was a slow accumulation of red flags that I willfully ignored. It was the mail that disappeared before I could see it. It was the way my dad would practically tackle the postman if he arrived when I was home. It was the weird phone calls where they would hang up the second I walked into the room. I was living in a fog of dutiful compliance. I was 22, working full-time, going to school part-time, and I had exactly $40 in my savings account because I had just loaned them nearly $1,000 for a property tax emergency. And get this, I found out later, years later, that the property taxes had been paid 3 months prior. That $1,000? And it went to a weekend getaway at a casino resort. They sent me photos from that weekend, claiming they were visiting a sick aunt. I remember looking at the background of the photo, seeing the slot machines blurred out, and forcing myself to believe they were just in a hotel lobby. That's how deep the denial went. I was helping them dig a hole, and I didn't even know they were throwing me into it. So, fast forward to about 6 months later. I was 23, and I had finally scraped together enough courage and cash to move out. I wasn't aiming for luxury here. I found this tiny studio apartment above a bakery in the bad part of town. The rent was cheap, the floors were slanted, and the whole place smelled faintly of yeast and exhaust fumes. But to me, it looked like the Taj Mahal. It represented the one thing I had never really had: boundaries. I remember waking up that morning feeling this electric hum in my chest. I put on my best blazer, the one I used for job interviews, and drove to the leasing office. I had my pay stubs printed out in a crisp manila folder. I had my references ready. I had calculated my budget down to the penny. I was ready to start my life. I walked into the leasing office, and the property manager was this sweet, older woman named Mrs. Higgins. She had photos of her grandkids on her desk and a bowl of mints. We were chatting, having a great time. She told me I was exactly the kind of tenant they wanted. Quiet, employed, responsible. She took my application fee, typed my information into her computer, and kept talking about how the morning sun hit the kitchen window in Unit 4B. And then, the typing stopped. The silence in that room was sudden and absolute. It wasn't just a pause in the conversation, it was a shift in the atmospheric pressure. I watched Mrs. Higgins squint at the screen. Then she took her glasses off, cleaned them on her cardigan, put them back on, and leaned in closer. The smile was gone. Her face had gone from grandmotherly warmth to this look of confusion and pity. When that was the worst part. The pity. She turned the monitor slightly away from me, cleared her throat, and asked me, very quietly, if I was aware of the active collections on my file. I laughed. I actually laughed out loud because I thought she was joking. I told her there had to be a mistake. I told her I had never owned a credit card in my life. I had a debit card and a savings account with $40 in it. That was it. I was debt-free. I was proud of being debt-free. Mrs. Higgins didn't laugh. She just slid a piece of paper across the desk. It was a summary of my credit report. I picked it up, and my hands were shaking so bad the paper was rattling. I looked at the number at the top, 420. I stared at it. I didn't even know credit scores went that low. It was a number you'd expect from someone who had filed for bankruptcy twice and fled the country. I scanned down the page and the room started to spin. My vision got tunnel narrow, like I was looking through a straw. There wasn't just one error, there were five. 5 credit cards. A Chase Sapphire, a Capital One Venture, a store card for Best Buy, a Discover card, and an Amex. All of them opened in my name. All of them maxed out. All of them in default or sold to collections. The total debt was just over $15,000. I mean, I couldn't breathe. It felt like someone had reached into my chest and crushed my lungs. I asked Mrs. Higgins to check the dates. Maybe it was identity theft from a stranger? Maybe someone hacked my social security number? She pointed to the addresses associated with the accounts. Every single card was registered to my parents' address. The billing statements were going to their house. The phone number on file? My dad's cell? The email address? My mom's old Hotmail account. Have you ever had a moment where your entire reality fractures? Where the people you love and the people destroying you turn out to be the exact same person? I don't remember leaving the office. I remember Mrs. Higgins looking at me with this heartbreaking sympathy and telling me that, unfortunately, they couldn't approve the lease. She basically said I was a liability. She tried to be nice about it, suggesting I get a co-signer, but the irony of that nearly made me scream. The only people who could co-sign for me were the ones who had put me in this hole. I walked out to my car, sat in the driver's seat, and threw up. I'm not being dramatic. I literally opened the door and retched onto the pavement. My body was rejecting the information physically. It was a visceral reaction to the betrayal. My ears were ringing with this high-pitched whine, drowning out the traffic. $15,000. I sat there, wiping my mouth with a fast food napkin, and the dots started to connect. The new TV, the leather jacket, the work trips, the smoker on the patio. They weren't struggling. They were partying, and they were funding their party by selling my future. I drove home on autopilot. I was running on pure adrenaline and rage. I rehearsed what I was going to say. I was going to kick the door down. I was going to scream until the windows shattered. I was going to throw the credit report in their faces and demand they pay it back right now. But when I pulled into the driveway, something stopped me. I saw them through the front window. They were sitting on the couch I had apparently bought, watching a movie on the TV I had paid for. They were laughing. They were eating pizza. They looked so comfortable, so unburdened. And looking at them, I realized something terrifying. If I went in there screaming, they would win. They would cry. They would deny it. They would say it was a misunderstanding. They would gaslighting me into thinking I had agreed to this, or that they did it for the family. They would play the victim card so hard that I would end up apologizing to them. They were masters at this. I was an amateur. If I confronted them now, without hard proof, without a plan, they would just destroy the evidence and call me crazy. They would spin the narrative to the rest of the family that Sarah was having a breakdown, that Sarah was making things up. My hands gripping the steering wheel slowly relaxed. The heat in my face cooled down into something icy and hard. The nausea faded, replaced by this cold, sharp clarity. I didn't go inside. I put the car in reverse and backed out of the driveway. I realized that the daughter who made them soup and loaned them money was dead. She died in that leasing office. The person sitting in the car now wasn't their child. I was a creditor. I was an investigator. And I wasn't going to get mad. I was going to get receipts. I drove to the library instead. I sat at a public computer, paid for an hour of internet, and started researching familial identity theft. I read about statutes of limitations. I read about affidavits. And I read about the difference between a civil dispute and criminal fraud. I realized that to really fix this and clear my name so I could have a life, I couldn't just ask them to pay it back. They didn't have the money. The money was gone. It was in the landfill in the form of old electronics and digested pizza. To clear my credit, I would have to prove to the banks that I didn't open those accounts. And the only way to prove that was to file a police report stating exactly who did. I sat there in the quiet of the library, listening to the hum of the hard drive. I thought about my mom singing those lullabies. I thought about my dad teaching me to ride a bike. I let myself feel the grief of it. I let myself cry, just for a minute, silently, hiding my face in my hands so the librarian wouldn't see. I really didn't want to do this. I wanted there to be another way. I wanted them to be the parents I thought they were. But then I looked at the credit report again. I looked at the dates. There was a charge on the Capital One card for $200 at a liquor store. The date was my 21st birthday. I remembered that day. They had told me they couldn't afford to get me a cake. They gave me a card with no money in it and told me they were proud of how independent I was becoming. Then they went out and spent $200 on booze using a card with my name on it. That was the moment the switch flipped permanently. I wiped my face. I printed out a checklist of what I needed. Account numbers, transaction histories, physical evidence of the items, and a confession, or at least an admission of knowledge. And I needed to break into my father's office, the locked filing cabinet in the den that we were forbidden from touching, the holy grail of their secrets. I packed up my papers. I went back to my car. I checked my watch. Tuesday. Bingo night. They would be gone from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. I had 3 hours to build my case. So, I sat in my car down the street, engine off, watching the house like I was a private investigator in a noir film. It was 5:58 p.m. At 6:02 p.m., the garage door rumbled open. I watched my dad's truck back out, my mom in the passenger seat applying her lipstick in the vanity mirror. They looked happy. They looked like a couple going out for a fun Tuesday night, completely unbothered by the fact that they had just nuked their daughter's financial future. Once their taillights disappeared around the corner, I waited another 5 minutes. Just to be safe. You have to understand, paranoia was starting to become my primary personality trait. I let myself in with my spare key. The house smelled the way it always did, a mix of stale cigarette smoke, lemon furniture polish, and that underlying scent of damp carpet that never quite dried. It was quiet. But it wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was the heavy, expectant silence of a crime scene. I walked straight to the den. This room was my dad's sanctuary. The office, he called it, which was funny because he didn't do any office work there. It was where he drank beer and watched sports on the second TV, a 40-inch plasma that I now realized I probably paid for too. In the corner stood the filing cabinet. It was an ugly, beige metal beast from the 90s. Locked, obviously. My dad always made a big show of keeping it locked to protect our sensitive documents from hackers. I used to think he was being responsible. Now I knew he was just hiding the bodies. I didn't have the key, but I knew my parents. They were creatures of habit, and they were lazy. I walked over to the bookshelf where my dad kept his bowling trophies. I lifted the third place, 2008 trophy. Nothing. I checked the world's best dad mug on the top shelf, the one I had bought him with my allowance money when I was 10. There it was. A small brass key resting in the bottom of the mug, covered in a layer of dust. The irony wasn't lost on me. I unlocked the cabinet. The drawer slid open with a screech of metal on metal that sounded like a scream in the empty house. I started flipping through the folders. Mortgage. Car insurance. Medical. It was all disorganized, stuffed with random flyers and coupons. Basically, a mess. I dug deeper, reaching the back of the drawer where the hanging folders were compressed tight, like they hadn't been touched in years. There was a thick manila envelope at the very back. It didn't have a label. It was just stuffed to the bursting point. I pulled it out. It was heavy. I sat down on the floor, crossed my legs, and dumped the contents onto the rug. It was an avalanche of paper. Credit card statements, collection notices, final warnings. But they weren't addressed to John or Mary. They were all addressed to Sarah. I picked up the first statement. It was from Chase. My hands were trembling, not from fear anymore, but from a kind of vibrating adrenaline. I smoothed the paper out on my knee. Account summary. Cardholder. Sarah. Last name. Total credit line. $5,000 available. Credit. $12.40 minimum payment. Due. $185. I felt the blood drain out of my face. They hadn't just used the card. They had maxed it out to within $12 of the limit. I started sorting the papers, organizing them by bank. I went into full auditor mode. I wasn't a daughter anymore. I was a forensic accountant. I needed to trace the timeline. I needed to see exactly what my life was worth to them. I found a stapled bundle from Best Buy. It was a store credit card statement attached to a physical receipt. I looked at the date. November 24th, 2 years ago. Black Friday. I remembered that Black Friday. My mom had called me, crying, saying they couldn't afford to fix the furnace and were freezing. She asked if I could send $300 for a space heater and some oil. I sent it. I ate instant ramen for 2 weeks to make up for it. I looked at the receipt in my hand. It wasn't for a furnace part. Item: Sony Bravia 65-inch 4K Ultra HD TV SKU 633501 price $1,299.99. Protection plan $249.99. Total charge to card ending in 8842 $1,642.98. I stared at the paper. They didn't fix the heat. They bought a home theater system. The space heater story was just a cover to get extra cash out of me while they were busy ruining my credit to buy luxury electronics. My ears started ringing. It was a high-pitched whine, like an old CRT monitor turning on. I felt cold, physically cold, sitting there on the rug. Have you ever discovered that your entire history with someone was based on a script they wrote without showing you? I kept digging. I needed more. I needed something undeniable, something that proved this wasn't just household necessities gone wrong. And then I found it. The smoking gun. It was a statement from the Capital One Venture card. The date was from last summer. I remembered that summer. My parents told me they had to go to Florida for a family funeral. A distant cousin I had never met. They made a big deal about how tragic it was, how expensive the flight was, how they were dreading the sadness of it all. They asked me to house sit and feed the cat. I pulled up the statement. Merchant, Carnival Cruise Lines. Description: 7-day Western Caribbean cruise. Stateroom, balcony passenger. 1. John, last name. Passenger. 2. Mary, last name. Total charge, $2,500. Below that, there were charges for the onboard bar. Blue Iguana Tequila Bar, $45. Alchemy Bar, $62. Casino Royale cash advance, $200. There was no funeral. There was no dead cousin. While I was feeding their cat and worrying about their grief, they were drinking margaritas on a balcony in the Caribbean, charging it all to my Social Security number. I sat there for a long time, just staring at the word casino. I didn't cry. I think I had run out of tears back in the leasing office. Instead, I felt this strange, icy calm settle over me. It was the feeling of a door closing and locking forever. I took out my phone. And I didn't steal the papers. That would be theft. And I needed to be cleaner than them. I laid each document flat on the rug. I took high-resolution photos of everything. The statements, the receipts, the collection notices that they had hidden from me. I made sure the dates and names were legible. I uploaded the photos to a cloud drive immediately. Then I emailed them to a secret account I had just made. I put everything back exactly how I found it. I stuffed the papers back into the envelope, shoved it into the back of the drawer, and locked the cabinet. I put the key back in the world's best dad mug. I stood up and looked around the room. It looked the same as when I walked in, but everything had changed. The TV on the wall wasn't a TV anymore. It was a crime scene exhibit. The leather recliner was evidence. I checked my watch. 7:15 p.m. They would be back in an hour and a half. I had the receipts. I knew the truth. But knowledge wasn't enough. I needed to ensure that this debt didn't follow me for the rest of my life. And unfortunately, the only way to do that was to make sure the debt went back to its rightful owners. I needed to prepare the trap. So, I slipped out of the house like a ghost. I locked the front door, checked it twice, and was back in my car before the automatic garage light even flickered off. Driving away from that house, I felt this weird sensation, like I was driving away from my childhood for the very last time, and I guess, in a way, I was. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table in my current shared apartment, surrounded by piles of paperwork. Basically, I turned my dining area into a war room. I knew that having the photos wasn't enough. The banks don't care about photos of a cruise itinerary. They care about legal declarations. So, I went to the Federal Trade Commission's website and downloaded the nuclear option, the identity theft affidavit. It's a terrifying document, honestly. It's pages and pages of government warnings. And it asks for specific dates, amounts, and, this is the kicker, the names of the suspects. I sat there with my pen hovering over the suspect information section. You have to understand, writing John and Mary last name in that box felt like signing a death warrant. I mean, my hand was physically cramping. I stared at the warning text at the bottom of the page. I declare under penalty of perjury that the information I have provided is true and correct. This wasn't a family squabble anymore. This was me preparing to classify my parents as federal criminals. Have you ever stared at a piece of paper and realized that a single signature is going to blow up your entire world? I filled it out. I listed every account. I listed the total amount, $15,432.18. I attached the printed photos of the receipts I had taken earlier. I organized it all into a crisp black folder. I even drafted a narrative statement for the police report I planned to file, detailing exactly how they had access to my social security number and how they hid the mail. I was methodical. I was cold. It was like I was preparing a case against a stranger. But here is where the reluctant executioner part of me kicked in. I couldn't just drop the hammer without giving them one final exit ramp. I needed to know, for my own sanity, that I had given them a chance to fix it. I needed to look them in the eye and see if there was any shred of decency left, or if the parents I loved were truly gone. So, I decided to wait until Sunday. Sunday was the mandatory family dinner. It was a ritual. Pot roast, mashed potatoes, and my dad talking about how the government was ruining the country. I texted my mom on Wednesday morning, "Hey, can't wait for Sunday. I have some big news to share about my apartment search." It made me sick to type it. I felt like a spy infiltrating an enemy camp. She texted back immediately with a string of heart emojis and said, "We love you. Dad is making his special gravy." The cognitive dissonance was blinding. How could they send heart emojis while actively drowning me in debt? For the next 4 days, I lived in a state of suspended animation. I went to work. I smiled at customers. I audited spreadsheets. But in the back of my mind, I was rehearsing the confrontation. I played out every scenario. Scenario A: they confess, apologize, and take out a second mortgage to pay me back. Unlikely. Scenario B: they deny it, scream, and gaslight me. Probable. Scenario C: they try to guilt trip me into paying it myself because we raised you. Almost guaranteed. I packed the black folder into my tote bag on Sunday morning. It weighed less than a pound, but it felt like I was carrying a loaded gun. I drove to their house. The lawn was freshly mowed. The smell of slow-cooked beef and onions wafted out to the driveway. It was the smell of home. It was the smell of safety. And for a split second, standing on that porch, I wanted to turn around. I wanted to burn the folder and just go back to being the ignorant, dutiful daughter. I wanted to eat the pot roast and pretend everything was fine. But then I thought about the 420 on that credit report. I thought about Mrs. Higgins looking at me with pity. I thought about the cruise they took while I was working double shifts. I took a deep breath, fixed a smile on my face, and opened the door. "I'm home," I called out. The trap was set. Now I just had to wait for them to walk into it. The Sunday dinner table was set like a stage for a play I had seen 1,000 times. The good china was out. The stuff with the little blue flowers that we weren't allowed to touch when I was a kid. There was a pot roast in the center, steaming and smelling of rosemary and onions, flanked by a mountain of mashed potatoes. My dad was already at the head of the table, tucking a napkin into his collar, looking for all the world like a king surveying his kingdom. My mom was bustling around the kitchen, humming some old radio tune, bringing out the rolls. It was terrifyingly normal. That was the worst part. I walked in carrying the evidence of a felony in my bag, and the house felt cozy. It felt safe. The TV in the other room was muttering the evening news. The refrigerator was humming, and for a second, and the smell of that roast hit me in the gut and made me want to cry. I sat down at my usual spot, the chair with the wobbly leg. My mom came over and heaped a massive spoonful of potatoes onto my plate. She smiled at me, that crinkly-eyed smile that used to make everything better when I was 6 years old. And here is where it gets hard. I looked at her, really looked at her, and I didn't just see the thief. I saw the woman who used to cut the crusts off my sandwiches because I was a picky eater. I saw the mom who sat on the floor with me for hours helping me glue glitter onto a science fair project. I missed that mom. I wanted that mom to be the real one. I sat there thinking, please just tell me it was a mistake. Please give me a reason not to destroy you. Have you ever sat across the table from someone you love, waiting for them to lie to you, while praying they'll tell the truth? My dad started the conversation the way he always did, by complaining about money. The irony was so thick I could practically taste it along with the beef. He started ranting about how the factory was cutting hours, how the government was taxing him to death, how nobody wants to work anymore. He was going on and on about personal responsibility and how hard it is for an honest man to get ahead in this world. I mean, I'm sitting there, clutching my fork so hard my knuckles were white, listening to a man who funded a Caribbean cruise with his daughter's identity lecture me about honest work. It took every ounce of self-control I had not to throw the mashed potatoes at him. I waited for a lull in the monologue. I took a sip of water to wet my throat, one which felt like sandpaper. "So," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I have some bad news about the apartment." The atmosphere at the table shifted instantly. My dad stopped chewing. My mom froze with the gravy boat midair. They exchanged a look, a microsecond glance that spoke volumes. It wasn't surprise. It was caution. I told them I got rejected. I told them the leasing agent laughed me out of the office. My dad let out this heavy, dramatic sigh. He shook his head and started saying that it's a tough market out there, that landlords are greedy, that I shouldn't worry because I could always stay here. He was playing the supportive father perfectly, but I pushed it. I said, "It wasn't the market, Dad, it was my credit score. They said it was 420. The silence that followed was deafening. The only sound was the clock ticking on the wall. My mom suddenly became very interested in her green beans. My dad took a long, slow drink of his beer. He set the glass down and didn't look at me. He looked at the TV in the other room. He basically muttered that credit scores are a scam anyway, just a way for the banks to control people. He tried to dismiss it entirely, waving his hand like he was swatting a fly. I didn't let him. I leaned forward. "Dad," I said. "The report listed 5 credit cards, $15,000 in debt. Do you know anything about that?" This was it. The last chance. The moment where they could have said, "Sarah, we were drowning. We're so sorry. We'll fix it." Instead, my dad's face turned that mottled purple color I knew so well. He slammed his fork down. He looked at me with this mix of outrage and disappointment, and he started yelling. Not apologizing, yelling. He asked me if I was accusing my own parents of being thieves. And he said I must have been hacked because I'm always on that damn phone. He told me I was being hysterical and ungrateful. Then my mom chimed in, and this hurt worse. Her voice went all high and pitchy, and she started crying. But it wasn't tears of guilt. It was tears of victimhood. She said she couldn't believe I would ruin a nice Sunday dinner with these wild accusations. She said they had sacrificed everything for me, that they gave me a roof over my head, and this is how I repay them? By interrogating them like a criminal? I watched them perfectly coordinate their defense. They were gaslighting me in stereo. They were doubling down on the lie. And get this. My dad actually looked me in the eye and said, "If you have debt, Sarah, maybe you should look at your own spending habits instead of blaming us." That was the trigger. That sentence. That specific sentence. Look at your own spending habits. The ringing in my ears stopped. The hesitation vanished. The ghost of the mom who cut the crusts off my sandwiches dissolved into mist. I looked at the world's best dad sitting across from me, and I realized he didn't love me. He loved the utility of me. He loved the credit line I provided. And he was willing to burn my future to keep his ego intact. I didn't scream. I didn't flip the table. I just nodded. Very slowly. I said, "Okay, you're right. It must be identity theft from a stranger." My dad relaxed instantly. He picked up his fork again, looking smug, thinking he had bullied me into submission one last time. He said that was more like it, and that we should probably just freeze my credit and forget about it. I stood up. My legs felt solid. "I'm going to go to the police station then," I said calmly. "Since it's a stranger, I need to file a fraud report to clear my name. The bank said that once I file the affidavit, the police will subpoena the transaction records and camera footage to find the guy who did it. The color drained out of my dad's face so fast he looked like a ghost. "Sit down," he ordered. His voice was low and dangerous. "I can't," I said. "I have to fix this. Thanks for the dinner." I walked to the door. I could feel their eyes burning into my back. I could hear my mom starting to sob for real this time, a panicked, hyperventilating sound. My dad was scraping his chair back, shouting my name, telling me to get back there right now. I didn't turn around. I walked out the front door, closed it gently behind me, and walked to my car. And I had given them the chance. They chose the lie. Now they were going to get the truth. So I drove straight from my parents' driveway to the police station. I didn't even turn on the radio. I just sat in the silence, listening to the tires hum against the asphalt, feeling this strange, vibrating lightness in my chest. It wasn't happiness. It was the feeling of a heavy backpack being cut off my shoulders. Walking into the precinct on a Sunday evening is a surreal experience. It smells like floor wax and stale coffee. The fluorescent lights hum with this clinical, headache-inducing buzz. I walked up to the desk, and the officer there, a guy who looked like he had seen everything and was impressed by nothing, asked, "Can he help me?" I placed the black folder on the counter. I told him I needed to file a report for identity theft and fraud. I told him the amount was over $15,000. He started the standard script. He grabbed a clipboard, looking bored, and basically said that these things are usually hard to track, that it's probably some hacker in a basement overseas, and that I shouldn't get my hopes up about recovering the money. He was already reaching for the unknown suspect form. And then I stopped him. I slid the suspect information sheet across the counter. I told him I knew exactly who did it. I told him I had the names, the addresses, and the photographic evidence of the purchases. He picked up the paper. He looked at the names. Then he looked at my ID. Then he looked at the names again. He saw the matching last names. He saw the shared address. The boredom vanished from his face instantly. He looked at me with this sharp, assessing gaze. He asked me, very quietly, if I was sure I wanted to proceed. Because once this ball started rolling, I wouldn't be able to stop it. He basically warned me that this was a felony charge and that pressing charges against family is a bell you can't unring. I thought about the 420 credit score. I thought about the lie at the dinner table. I thought about the cruise. I looked him in the eye and told him to file it. For the next 3 weeks, my life turned into a masterclass in bureaucratic warfare. I became a machine. I scanned the police report. I sent it to the fraud departments of Chase, Capital One, Best Buy, and American Express. I sent it to the 3 major credit bureaus. I included the affidavit where I swore under penalty of perjury that these debts were not mine. And here is where the slow burn really kicked in. The silence from my parents was absolute. They thought they had won. They thought I had stormed out of dinner just to go home and cry. They assumed I was bluffing. They were probably sitting in that living room right now, watching the 65-inch TV, thinking I was just being a dramatic millennial who would eventually get over it and come back to apologize. But while they were watching TV, the gears of the financial system were grinding slowly in my direction. First, the provisional credits appeared in my account. The banks removed the debt from my name while they investigated. My credit score jumped 150 points overnight. It was like breathing oxygen after holding my breath for 5 years. Then the investigation phase ended. The banks confirmed the fraud. They traced the IP addresses. And they matched the signatures on the receipts, which were clearly my mom's shaky cursive, not mine. And since the debt was valid but not mine, they didn't just delete it. They reassigned it. The banks went after the people who actually spent the money. The first domino fell on a Tuesday. I got a voicemail from my dad. He wasn't screaming yet. He sounded confused. He basically said that his debit card had been declined at the gas station and he couldn't access his checking account. He wanted to know if I had done something to the family plan. I didn't answer. 2 days later, the second domino fell. The wage garnishment hit. Because I had filed a police report for a felony amount, and because the banks were now aggressively pursuing recovery, they had moved fast. They froze my parents' assets pending the investigation. My phone started blowing up. I'm talking 50 calls in an hour. Texts that ranged from, "Please call us, we're scared," to, "You ungrateful brat, what did you do?" I didn't block them. I needed the evidence for the harassment file I was building. I just watched the notifications roll in like a ticker tape of their destruction. And that brings us back to the driveway. It was exactly 4 weeks after the dinner. I knew it was happening because the tow company had to notify the registered owner of the vehicle before repossession, and since my name was still technically on the secondary title for the truck, another thing they tricked me into signing years ago, I got the alert. I drove over. I parked 3 houses down. I sipped my coffee. The repo truck backed in. It was a massive, predatory machine. The driver hopped out. A big guy in a neon vest who clearly did this for a living and didn't care about sob stories. My dad came running out of the house. He was wearing his bathrobe. He looked smaller than I remembered. The arrogance from the dinner table was gone, replaced by a frantic, sweaty panic. He was screaming at the driver. I couldn't hear every word through the glass, but I could read the body language. He was pointing at the house. He was pointing at his chest. He was doing the, "Do you know who I am?" routine. He was trying to physically block the tow hitch with his body. The driver just ignored him. He moved with this brutal efficiency, hooking the chains, checking the tension, lifting the hydraulic bed. Then my mom came out. She wasn't crying this time. She looked shell-shocked. She was holding a letter in her hand, probably the foreclosure warning or the lawsuit notice from the credit card companies. And then, they saw me. I had rolled down my window just an inch to hear the sound of the chains. My dad locked eyes with me. For a second, I thought he was going to attack the car. He started charging down the driveway toward me. His face was twisted into something unrecognizable. It wasn't anger anymore. It was hatred. Pure, unadulterated hatred. He reached my car window. He slammed his hand against the glass. He was screaming so hard spit was flying. Basically, he unleashed everything. He screamed that I was a traitor. He screamed that I had ruined the family over a few dollars. He shouted that they gave me life, that they put clothes on my back, that family is supposed to protect each other no matter what. He looked at me with these wild, bloodshot eyes and demanded to know how I could sleep at night. He said I was cold-hearted. He said I was dead to him. He was gasping for air, waiting for me to crack, waiting for me to apologize and stop the truck. I looked at him. I looked at the repo driver who was now dragging the F-150 out of the driveway, the tires screeching against the pavement like a banshee. I looked at the neighbors watching from their porches. I felt nothing. No guilt. No fear. Just the cool, clean feeling of justice. I rolled the window down the rest of the way. I leaned out just slightly. I looked him dead in the eye. He was panting, waiting for my excuse. I simply said, "You told me to fix my spending habits, so I returned the things I didn't buy." I rolled the window up. His mouth fell open. He stood there, frozen, as the repo truck roared past him, carrying away his pride and joy. He looked like a statue of a man who had just realized that the ATM machine finally ate his card. I put my car in drive and pulled away slowly. I didn't speed off. I drove exactly the speed limit. I watched him in the rearview mirror, shrinking smaller and smaller, standing alone on the sidewalk of a house he probably wouldn't own for much longer. The cold justice was complete. So, it's been exactly 14 months since I watched that tow truck turn the corner. And if you think the repo was the end of the story, You don't understand how the banking system works. That was just the opening ceremony for their misery. The fallout wasn't quick. It was a slow, grinding suffocation. Basically, once the fraud investigation concluded, the banks didn't just walk away. They sold the remaining debt to aggressive collection agencies, the kind that don't care about sob stories or family emergencies. My dad tried to file for bankruptcy about 3 months later. I heard this through my aunt, who called me screaming that I had put my parents on the street. But here is the kicker, and I know this because I work in the industry. Debts incurred through fraud are generally not dischargeable in bankruptcy. You can't steal money, spend it, and then ask a judge to wipe the slate clean. The judge looked at the police report, looked at the affidavit where I swore they stole my identity, and basically threw their application out. So, the wage garnishment stuck. Every other Friday, 25% of my dad's paycheck vanishes before it even hits his account. It goes straight to Capital One and Chase. He's working overtime at the plant not to buy new toys, but to pay for a vacation he took 2 years ago. They lost the house. Obviously. They couldn't refinance with their credit destroyed. And without the extra cash flow they were stealing from me, they couldn't keep up the mortgage payments. They downsized to a 2-bedroom rental on the other side of town. I heard from a neighbor that my dad had to sell the smoker, the remaining TVs, and even his bowling clubs just to cover the security deposit. The social ruin was quieter, but I think that hurt them more than the money. You know how small towns are. People talk. The neighbors saw the police cars, they saw the repo truck. The narrative shifted. They weren't the struggling victims anymore. They were the people who stole from their own kid. The barbecue invites stopped coming. The wave hellos from the mailbox stopped happening. They became pariahs in the very kingdom they tried so hard to impress. As for me, I finally got the apartment. Not the one with the slanted floors above the bakery, but a better one. It has a dishwasher. It has a balcony. It has a lease with my name on it, and only my name. My credit score is 740 today. I check it every morning, not out of fear anymore, but as a reminder. It's like a scar that healed over. It doesn't hurt, but it proves I survived. I haven't spoken to them since that day in the driveway. I blocked their numbers, blocked their emails, blocked their flying monkeys, the relatives who tried to guilt me into making peace. Sometimes, usually late at night, I wonder if they miss me. Not the bank account I provided, but me. The daughter who made them soup, the daughter who laughed at their jokes. But then I remember the silence at the dinner table when I asked for help. I remember the lie, and I realize they don't miss me. They miss the access. I'm sitting on my balcony right now. I'm eating a bowl of cheap noodles, the kind that cost 40 cents a pack. I'm drinking tap water. It's not a steak dinner. It's not a Caribbean cruise. But everything I see, the fork, the bowl, the chair I'm sitting on, is mine. Nobody can take it away from me. Nobody can leverage it against me. The air out here is cool and quiet. It doesn't smell like cigarette smoke or desperation. It smells like freedom. And honestly, that's the only luxury I ever really wanted.